Move this up a bit. Thank you all for coming. I let Bruce know when I came and talked to his class that I grew up 15 minutes from the University of Maryland and then spent 5 years at God's own university, the University of Virginia. I have issues about whether this feels like a safe space to me. But I will try and get over all of the anxiety and issues I have with being at Duke University from my early childhood trauma of being beaten by the Duke University basketball team. So I wrote this book, which is available outside. Apparently, I didn't even know this. The book is available, although you should have gotten people to buy it before the talk. After the talk, maybe people will not be quite so interested. The book was written with Brink Lindsey, who used to be the vice president of the Cato Institute, and the original idea was that I was more of a liberal and Brink was more of a libertarian, but we were writing a book together about that. In part, one of the man bikes dog part about this is that during a period of high polarization, here was a whole book on big meaty economic issues that actually showed here's a big agenda that people on the libertarians and liberals can agree on. And the only problem is, over the course of writing that book, both Brink and I sort of converged ideologically, so it's a little unfair. Now we have to say, it was written by somebody who was a liberal and was a libertarian, because we've sort of converged so much. But I want to start out this book by describing a paradox, the conservative paradox. On the one hand, conservatives traditionally have believed it was their job to defend inequality, that attacks on inequality are simply the result of envy or an inadequate understanding of the justice of returns in a market economy. That's one side. On the other side, conservatives, at places like Cato and other places, spend a lot of time arguing that our economy is pervasively and increasingly regulated and characterized by rent-seeking. So you have these two sides. The claim of the captured economy is these two beliefs are increasingly in conflict. If you believe that rent-seeking is pervasive, then you would expect it to influence the distribution of income. And that means that conservatives and libertarians have no reason to assume that the distribution of income is just, right? So in some ways, conservative may be defending the distribution of income from an entirely different economy, right? But that doesn't mean they're defending the distribution of income from this economy, the real world economy that we're actually involved in, and that conservatives often critique, right, in terms of the engagement of the government in regulation. If that's true, then it may be the case that increasing inequality is signaling something that even market-oriented people should care about. And that's the argument I'm going to try and make to you this afternoon. So there are a lot of accounts of why inequality has been going up. So back when I was a boy, back in the Neolithic era, lots of conservatives spent their time dismissing the idea that inequality was increasing. They looked at the evidence and they said, you slice it this way and it's not, right? But increasingly, no one does this, right? Increasingly, the actual evidence on both income inequality and even more important, capital inequality is so large and the trend is so big that no one denies it. But there are a lot of questions about what's behind it, what's actually driving the increase in inequality, that there's some differences on the margins about degree, but almost no one disagrees about the trend. On the one hand, you have sort of the standard economist argument, which is that it's driven by the increasing returns on skill, driven by the increasing scope of the market. And this argument is fairly simple. The larger the scope of the market is, the larger returns that come to those at the top of the distribution, right? And so if you have economies, if you have a world economy that's broken up into 100 more or less separate economies, then the top winner in each of those 100 economies is going to be a lot smaller than if you have one economy made up of all those 100 countries with one winner at the top, right? That one winner at the top is simply going to be a lot bigger than the 100 that were in separate economies. And if that's true, if you've got, therefore, the winners, the people with the most skill, the most to contribute to the economy, are going to be getting a lot more, then the economist answer has often been more education, right? We either more or we need to reform education, right? But if the returns on skill are going up, then we need more. We need to actually invest more to make sure that Americans in particular are the ones who are reaping those increasingly high returns to skill. Second, people on the left generally tend to argue, and that's what you might think of as the center kind of story. That's a story that most sort of moderate economists tend to tell. The second, right, that tends to be on the left, it tells a story about the declining power of labor. And they say, well, the basic distribution of income is determined by the relative power of capital and labor, right? Who's actually got the ability to get their way in a battle over a fixed pie. And when labor was generally collectively organized, it had more ability to get more out of the resources that were available. And as labor unions have been broken up or been weakened, that bargaining power of labor has gone down. The answer, therefore, is more unions, more collective bargaining. A third explanation that you see a lot on the right tells a story about culture, that the basic underlying causes of inequality are what you might think of as pre-market factors. So Charles Murray has told the story in Coming Apart, right, that the basic thing driving income are family, society, religion, right, and that increasingly we have two cultures in the United States, one with a high degree of ability to organize people for deferred gratification, for education, to do all the things that lead you to get high incomes, and another underclass. And there, the policy remedy is a little less clear, but it's something like moral uplift. And Charles Murray actually says this at the end of Coming Apart. He says, look, the upper middle class needs to go and do a lot of preaching and waving its finger at the lower classes and tell them to clean up their act. The fourth tells a story about what you might think of as capitalism's iron law. This is Thomas Piketty in his famous book, Capital in the 21st Century. He says that the basic process of unregulated capitalism generally tends toward the concentration of capital at the top, right, as processes of inheritance and other things generally lead to the accumulation of capital in fewer and fewer hands. And interestingly, there's a parallel story on the right that says, actually, yes, capitalism leads to more and more inequality, but it produces so much economic growth that it's okay, right? That the economic growth it produces makes everybody better, and even though it produces more inequality, that's fine. The interesting thing is both Piketty and people on the right both believe capitalism has this basic iron law. The only difference is what they think of it. The interesting thing is almost all of these theories think that inequality is a natural feature of a capitalist economy. If you deregulate the economy, if you take out the role of government, the more you do that, the more you liberate the economy to produce inequality. So in that sense, again, equality is a natural feature of a capitalist economy, and up to a point, it certainly is. But let's note some interesting facts. When you look at the very top earners, right? If you go, New York Times a few years ago published this nice infographic that showed, who was in the top 1%. And you notice there's a massive disproportion of individuals in fields characterized by industry-specific regulation and market structure. And that's what I'm talking about. When I talk about regulation tonight, I'm talking about something specific, right? So I'll just say this again. I'm talking about industry-specific regulation and market structure. So I'm not talking about environmental regulation. I'm not talking about anti-discrimination, those kinds of regulation. I'm talking about firm-specific that generally tend to have the effect of creating a barrier to entry to the market, right? So we'll come, and that is their protectionist forms of regulation. So when you look at it, you look at who's in the top 1%. Well, who's there? Right? Especially at the very top, there's a massive group of people in finance. Well, finance is characterized by enormous government role in securitization, the subsidy of retirement savings, implicit guarantees, low capital requirements, right? All of these things are cases where there's a pervasive government regulation, right? I always joke, even though lots of people in finance wave around copies of Atlas Shrugged, right? Very few of them are actually telling the government to take their bailouts and go back home with them, right? Lots of them, those people waving around Atlas Shrugged, are also managing money in 401ks and IRAs that are massively subsidized by the government. Second, you look at who's in the top 1%, especially the tippy top of the 1%, you see a lot of people in fields with enormous intellectual property protection, patents, copyrights. And these have become massively larger in the last 30 years. And again, this is the irony of the last 30 years. Bruce and I were talking about people who discussed the last 30, 40 years as an era of neoliberalism, which is the new insult du jour. But they describe it as an era that's a deregulatory era, right? Well, from the point of view of the things I study in the captured economy, this looks anything but a deregulatory era, right? This looks like an era of increasing and pervasive regulation, but regulation with a very different impact. So in IP, right, which has enormous impacts on the incomes in entertainment, that's music, films, other things, right? And drugs, software, right? All that's very massively represented in the top 1%. Intellectual property protection has become enormously more stringent, right? And what that means is, especially in fields like entertainment, that magnifies the returns at the very, very top, right? Again, IP is a field, entertainment's a field with a very few winners, but the people who win, if you're Taylor Swift, you get an enormous return, and you got a much bigger return than you would 35 years ago because of increasingly stringent intellectual property protection. Further down the 1%, still there, right? Lots of doctors, lawyers, dentists, optometrists, right? Your uncle, right? At least my uncle, a lot of them are in these areas, which makes it very hard to talk about this book when I see my family. These are all licensed professions. They're pervasively regulated, right? They regulate who can enter, and in almost all these areas, as you know from the North Carolina dentist decision recently, right? They control all the licensing boards that determine who gets to be their competition, right? That turns out to not be incidental to their much higher salaries than you find in other countries. Also in the 1%, you see other pervasively regulated fields like real estate development, car dealers, right? Car dealers, in fact, are a group of quite wealthy and often very politically influential people who are in an occupation that would almost certainly not exist if it were not for state laws that require franchising of automobiles. Finally, we also see the explosion of constraints on development in high growth areas, which have the effect of massively increasing the value of real estate, but that also politicize the use of real estate so that a very few people with political connections are able to magnify their returns. So in a supposedly deregulatory era, these fields have all gotten more regulated. Right? If you look, for example, at occupational licensing, there's been a huge increase in occupational licensing over the last 40 to 50 years. And that's true if you look at the value of the implicit subsidy in finance, it's gone up enormously. So regulatory constraints help explain why many of these fields have also not experienced the bonfire of rents driven by innovation that one might have expected in a neoliberal era, right? If this was really an era of unbridled capitalism and deregulation, right? You would have thought that there would have been, that the excess returns that doctors and lawyers and optometrists and everybody were getting, you would expect that would have driven a lot of competition, that would have driven down their salaries, right? New business models that would have done so, and yet we've seen very little of that. So if we're looking for an explanation for inequality, an increase in upward redistributing rents seems like it would be a good place to look, right? That's where the smoke is, judging by the distribution of income in the top 1%, and that's a good reason to think there might be fire. Okay. How can this happen? Right? Again, in the same era, right, lots of the rents that protected incomes at the bottom have been systematically taken away, right? That's one thing that collective bargaining and unions do, right? It produces a rent, and you can think it's good or bad, right? But that collective bargaining allows labor to extract a larger income than it would in a completely free labor market. So how could this happen politically? Well, let me tell you a story about, at least a story I have, about politics. And this starts from a little bit, builds on the argument that Mansur Olson had in The Logic of Collective Action. And this starts with the idea that democracy is not ruled by the people. Democracy is ruled by the organized, right? Democracy is a system that is sensitive to those who mobilize and relatively insensitive to those who do not. And as Olson argued, right, concentrated interests generally tend to organize and diffuse interests do not, right? So the classic example of this is milk producers in the Northeast, right, organize for the New England Dairy Compact that ends up raising the prices that they charge for milk, but milk consumers do not, right? That's the classic example, because milk, the dairy farmers get a huge percentage of their income that comes from that regulation, but people who go into Star Market in Boston to buy their milk generally barely even notice. So the milk farmers, the people who produce milk from cows, they organize, and the milk buyers do not. So the organized are better able to aggregate their strength as individuals into concentrated power, right? They're able to take that strength, right? But they're able to project it to politicians because they're able to be organized, right? Second, they're better able to develop a coherent understanding of their interest and chart a strategy for achieving them, right? Those relatively few milk producers can get around a table and say, well, what are we going to do? Let's all pitch in to buy, hire a lobbyist, and we'll be able to keep our milk subsidies, right? Third, they're better able to engage in surveillance of office holders in order to encourage them to act in their favor. One of the most important things in democracy is information, right? It's possible to organize to get your way, and one of the things you do when you organize is you can have people watching what office holders are doing, right? Most people don't have the time, they don't have the resources to engage in surveillance, so office holders have a relatively free hand. But those who are organized are able to make sure that office holders know they're watching, right? And therefore, they're much more likely to get their way. Finally, and I think very important for all these cases of rent seeking that we discuss in the book, the organized are able to invest in the creation of persuasive fictions that mask their pursuit of self-interest, right? So again, if anybody watches the morning talk shows on Sunday, does anybody know what I'm talking about, right? Where they have, Meet the Press or whatever, and the ads are always things like Archer Daniels Midland, we're food, right? And you're like, or Northrop Grumman, right? Protecting America, right? Why are they doing that? Why are they putting all these, things right next to the pharmaceutical ads on Meet the Press? The reason they're doing that is they're trying to create persuasive fictions. They're trying to create an image in people's head, right? That Archer Daniels Midland, right, is the thing that causes your, families to have food to be able to feed themselves, right? And therefore to not make people think of them as, greedy feeders at the public trough, right? Which arguably both Archer Daniels Midland and Northrop Grumman are. So if organization's that important for explaining who gets what from politics, this turns out to be very important in class terms because there's a very strong correlation between organization and social class, right? Not everyone across the income spectrum organizes to the same degree, right? And we know this, Schlossman and Brady showed that the ability to organize for collective action, the degree to which people contribute to interest groups, is enormously tilted upward. So it's not just that that concentrated interests, as Olson argued, are the most likely to get over the collective action problem, but it's relatively wealthy concentrated interests that are able to get over the collective action problem. So the advantage, those with educational qualifications, social networks, and income are much more likely to organize for their interests than the disadvantaged. And when the disadvantaged are able to get their voice heard in politics, as Marty Gillen's found, it's typically because the relationship between organization and economic advantage has been disrupted for some reason, but often unusually in the case of, for example, teachers' unions. So what do the organized want? Right? What are this relatively concentrated interests with generally more economic power? What do they generally want? Well, the demands of interest vary enormously. In the economic realm, organized interests typically want to preserve their status, right? They've already got something and they want to hold on to it. And there's a whole political science reason why this is generally characterized as people who tend to organize. But one thing we know is generally groups get what they want from government and then they organize to keep it, right? That's opposite to our Schoolhouse Rock image of how politics works, which is people all get together and they say, hey, if we all organize, we'll be able to get something from government. But it turns out, generally people get what they want from government for some reason, and then somebody goes out and organizes them to keep it, right? So they've already got something they want, so generally all they have to do is play defense. And it turns out that American institutions are systematically biased toward people playing defense, people who've already got what they want. And that's opposite to the story that we often think about separation of powers, right? The original argument for separation of powers was partially that it would constrain the growth of government, right? And it turns out it does do that on the way up. But it also slows government retraction on the way down, right? Because all those multiple different branches that you have to pull together to get government activity, right? Also, you have to go through all that same process to undo something that government's already done. So separation of powers is very good for those who are playing defense. So while some want their status to be preserved against shift in the market, people want it preserved against shifts in government action. While economists like creative destruction, organized interests do not, right? Almost every organized interest is a conspiracy against creative destruction, right? That's generally what they want, is they want to keep what they've already got. They want to keep some existing system of arrangements. And that's not just true of particular industry sectors like farming or manufacturing, but of social classes as well, whose organization in politics is typically oriented toward maintaining their ability to transfer status intergenerationally. If that story is true, as society becomes more organized, creative destruction shrinks. Or rather, it shrinks for the organized, whereas for the disorganized, there may be relatively little shielding them from the forces of market or state-generated change in status, right? So we're beginning to see a theory of inequality here, right? Which is that those at the top can invest in political action designed to preserve their status and preserve, in particular, government programs that protect them from competition, while those at the bottom do not. Right? And that's generally going to lead to an expansion of inequality. Put in dynamic terms, we should expect to see a relative calcification of status change among the organizationally advantaged and a relative decline in status among the disadvantaged. Markets will increasingly determine the status of the less wealthy, but politics will determine that of the more advantaged. This would predict exactly the increase in income and wealth at the top and the atrophying of it at the bottom that we've seen over the last 40 years. I should just note that this, what I've just described, is a very good prescription for economic populism. So what are the predictions of this theory? One is that in the absence of disruptions to the system of political organization, economic growth will slow down. Right? If we believe with Schumpeter that creative destruction is the basic motor of economic growth, right? And the ability to tear down existing business models, tear down existing firms that have gotten calcified, and replace them with entirely new business models, entirely new products, right? That process and the speed with which it operates is the key to economic growth. But the more we see this rent-seeking, especially at the top, the more that's going to slow down. Second, social mobility will decline as the organized lock in their advantage through state action while the disorganized cannot. Third, inequality will increase over time as rents generated by organization at the top of the social system increase. Those rents will then be redistributed into political organization, those excess profits. One thing you could do with those excess profits is you can take them and invest them back into the political system to either expand your rents or protect them from attack. So are these predictions of the theory borne out? I think so, or else I wouldn't have published this book. So what's the quantitative evidence? Well, most of the quantitative evidence for this, any of these pieces into them on their own are just suggestive, but I think when taken together, they're quite persuasive, right? So an economy characterized by rent seeking should see the following things. One, an increasing rate of profit, right? Because of a decline in competition. In general, excess profit is an invitation to market economy to competition, which then drives profit down. Right? But if we're seeing less competition, we should see an increasing rate of profit. We should see greater persistence of high profits, right? So firms that have very high profit should be able to hold on to them longer than they did before. We should see greater industry concentration and a decline in new entrants. It turns out that's exactly what we've seen. One, post-tax profits as a percentage of GDP rose from a trough of 3% in the mid-'80s to above 11% in 2013, and they're even higher now. While returns for the median firm have risen gently over the past 30 years, return at the 90% percentile of profitability have skyrocketed from under 30% in the mid-'80s to over 100% in the past few years. Third, we've seen an increased persistence of high profits. 85% of firms with returns on invested capital above 25% in 2003 were still enjoying returns above 25% in 2013. Exactly the opposite of what we would predict if increased profits drove in new competition, thereby driving profits down. We've seen increasing concentration. The share of total industry revenue accounted for by the 50 biggest firms in that industry rose in 3/4 of the broad non-farm business sectors tracked by the Census Bureau. Finally, the relative presence of young firms, that is under 5 years old, exactly the kind of firms that should be coming in order to take advantage of the higher profits they want to steal away from the big boys in the economy, has been shrinking. The share of the American workers employed at young firms has dropped from nearly 19% in the late 80s to just over 10% as of 2010. Now, some of that's probably due to decreases in antitrust enforcement, as well as purely market forces, but there's little reason to think that's all of it. Okay, finally, what could we do about that? If I persuaded you so far that this is a reasonable way to think about what's gone on in the American economy over the last 40 years, and we'll find out, I guess, in about 3 minutes whether I did. What can we do about it? The basic argument here is that rent seeking is fundamentally a political problem. It's a result of inadequate political competition in order to drive economic competition. In the absence of effective political competition, what you get is increasing economic oligopoly. So what could we do about that? And the argument we make in the book is that you need deliberation, right? That in general, rent seeking is a failure of effective deliberation. And so there's work, for example, by Frank Baumgartner over, I'm not even supposed to mention that other place in Chapel Hill, but he's over there, has done work that show that most areas where there's things that we generally characterize as rents have a political environment in which there's a lot of organization on one side and nothing on the other, right? So you see things like congressional hearings where all the people are arguing for one position. And it goes all the way down to town councils making development decisions where everybody is against building that new apartment building in town and nobody is on the other side, right? That, what he characterizes as policy monopoly, is exactly the environment you would want for preserving rents, because it's an environment in which there's not going to be deliberation, right? You don't actually have to make persuasive arguments to policymakers if there's nobody arguing on the other side. So, so the basic argument we make is, what would be pro-deliberative mechanisms? What would be mechanisms that would both put information in front of policymakers about the costs of these rent-seeking arrangements, and that would give them some pressure to do something about it? Well, one, we argue, is subsidized countervailing power. Right? If the problem is unbalanced organization, right? All the organization is on the side of rent seekers and there's no organization on the other. Well, in our democratic society, we have evidence of the kind of thing that can do something about that. So in the book, we talk about two examples, one on the left and one sort of on the center right. You go back to the late 1960s and early 70s, right? You can think about pollution as a form of rent, right? So it's because it's excess profits as a result of not pricing a factor of production. But this was very powerful, right? And one of the reasons was there was enormous organization on the side of auto companies that didn't want to be regulated. In this case, regulation means simply paying for the costs that you're imposing on others, right? And there was no organization on the other side, and foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, like that, actually invested an enormous amount of money in helping create the entire infrastructure of modern interest groups we associate with the environmental movement, NRDC, EDF, Friends of the Earth, right? All that was partially created by subsidization of countervailing power on the part of foundations, and it helped equalize the political process so that now, right, and the environmentalists don't always win, but on any particular battle, policymakers are almost certain to get information on both sides, right? So you don't have policy monopoly. The second argument, and again, this draws from a wonderful book by Terry Moe called Special Interest about teacher union power. He argued that until recently, in almost every jurisdiction in the country, teachers' unions were likely to be enormously represented whenever any political decision was being made on schools, and almost nobody was organized on the other side, right? And that made the path of least resistance to do what teachers wanted and allowed them often to extract rents from the political process in the form of not so much actually increasing salaries, but decreasing pressures on low performers. Again, one thing we had in the United States is we do have this these enormous foundations, and they've actually invested in a lot of money into creating countervailing power in the form of pro-education reform organizations that are able to show up in Hartford, Connecticut, or Baltimore, Maryland, or DC, or New York City, and make sure that policymakers have information on both sides of these questions. And that has turned out to have an enormous effect, whether you think good or ill, but it's had an enormous effect on the politics of that area as well. So again, subsidizing countervailing power, subsidizing competition through philanthropy turns out to be a very important factor, right? Second is increasing legislative and executive information capacity. One of the most powerful tools that rent seekers have is the absence of information on the other side, right? And one way to get that is from the outside, creating new external organizations. But the other thing is to make government less dependent for its information on outside sources, right? And so one thing we've seen over the last 25 years is a systematic cutting away at the legislative information capacity that in particular Congress has, but to a lesser degree state legislatures. And the more that their staff, both committee staff and personal staff, have been cut down, the more dependent they are on lobbyists, right? And lobbyists are often telling them that there'll be dire, terrible consequences if they get rid of this rent-seeking regulation. You see this all the time in finance. Anybody who talks about getting rid of many of the implicit subsidies for finance, the first thing that financial lobbyists say is, oh, it'll be terrible, the economy will break, and then you'll all get blamed. Congressmen hear that, and they're just like, oh, okay, I'll just kind of put my head back down and pretend like nothing happened. If Congress had more internal capacity, they had more ability to understand these issues without having to rely on the information from the financial industry, they would be better able to evaluate the information being provided them by lobbyists, right? Third thing that we could do if we want to reduce rent seeking is to change the rules of the game, and particularly the involvement of general purpose actors, right? So one of the things is almost all these areas of capture are a result of the fact that you have special purpose government entities, right, that turn out to be very easily captured by those they regulate, whether that's in finance with the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FDA with drug companies, right? One thing you can do is increase the involvement of general purpose government entities that have an interest in efficiency broadly understood, right? And so one example of this is OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has an office called the Office of Independent Regulatory Authority, right? I think that's right. And what they do is they create central review of all major regulations, right? And so even though a entity may get capture over a regulatory agency on its own, that still has to be, they still have to convince OMB that it passes the test of a cost-benefit analysis, right? You see the same thing with the FTC, where a lot of these professional licensing agreements are concerned, right? So the FTC has gotten very involved in things like the licensing of doctors at the state level. The North Carolina dentist case is a good example. And the FTC people who do these issues generally tend to be very pro-competition, pro-economic growth, pro-creative destruction, and they're much less likely to get captured than industry-specific regulations, right? Finally, and we talked about this a lot in the book, right? There's an argument for what you might call egalitarian Lochnerism, right? Right now, really still drawing on New Deal kinds of precedents, courts generally tend to be highly deferential to licensing boards, like the dentists, right, in North Carolina. And we argue in the book for a much more, what you might think of as pro-deliberative role for courts, right? Not necessarily striking down regulatory regimes like this on the basis of economic freedom, but saying if you're going to do that, if you're going to regulate and allow the dentists to set their own salaries, legislators need to put their hand on it. And they need to do it over and over again, right, to authorize that this is what they want, rather than simply passing this on to unaccountable regulatory boards. Finally, we argue in the book that in order to, in a way, go at this huge mass of upward redistributing regulations, we need to think in new ideological terms, right? Almost all of our last 40 years of American politics have been characterized by a left versus right on the question of whether we should have more government or less, right? And whether we should have more inequality or less, right? That's been the axis of political competition, right? But the thing that's characteristic of all the issues I've talked about before is none of them are really squarely on the side of more or less government, right? That is, liberals generally tend to be in favor of government activism and against constitutional or other kinds of constraints on government action. But part of the argument of this book is lots of the inequality we've got as a result of an absence of constitutional constraints in some ways on government. And simultaneously, conservatives need to get more upset about inequality, especially if they realize how much of inequality is not a result of the absence of government, but its presence. And we argue that this is really a call for what we call libertarianism, a combination of the social justice concerns of liberals, but the recognition that libertarians have of the ways that government can be captured by concentrated interests, and the value of constraint, the value of constitutional norms in the governing of our economic life. Thank you very much.